Some stories don't stay still. They grow up with you. You know the beginning and the end, and yet every time you return to them, they feel like a different story. But it's not the story that's changed. It's you. When I watched Dead Poets Society for the first time as a teenager, I couldn't be bothered to pay attention. They screened it in class. A decade later, as a student myself, I found myself spellbound by Keating, by the joyful way he showed his boys the door out of conformity and self-erasure. And each time I've returned since, I've found something new in it. These days, with my student years long behind me, I feel a certain kinship with Keating, the pull to pass on what I've learned to the ones coming up behind me. The movie became a mirror, reflecting back where I was in life. The 1998 psychological horror game Sanitarium is such a story. Sanitarium is a classic tale of catabasis, a descent into the underworld of a grieving mind haunted by trauma and unprocessed guilt. Like Dante, this descent has layers. You can play through Sanitarium and only skim the surface, and you'll get a surreal odyssey of religious statuary, screaming clowns, and Zerg rushes against Cyclopes. At first, it feels random, untethered, the kind of chaos that looks like noise until you realize it's a signal. The deeper you descend, the more the chaos reveals a pattern, a structure, a labyrinth with intention behind every turn. It didn't need to go this deep, but it does because it has something to say about identity, about trauma, about grief, and about integration. Now, I have to admit, 10 years ago I played Sanitarium, and I was so captivated by it that I made a video on it. That old video barely scratched the surface. That was partly due to time pressure from a terrible multi-channel network I was stuck in at the time, but honestly, the main reason is that I wasn't ready for the lower layers. Life hadn't taken me there yet. 10 years, and what feels like a lifetime of loss, trauma, and grief in my own life later, it felt like a completely different game. Same broadcast, entirely different bandwidth. So when I think back on that old video now, yeah, we can do better than this. Sanitarium is a story that trusts its audience and doesn't reveal itself all at once, and that's exactly how we're gonna approach it. In this video, instead of simply going through it front to back, we're going deep, excavating layer for layer down into the underworld of grief. Before we descend any deeper, I need to take a quick break for this video's sponsor, Bootdev. There's a thread running through this whole video about doing the work, about putting in effort and having something real come back, and that happens to be the exact thing Bootdev is built around. If you've watched my stuff before, you might remember me talking about them. I have a background in software development, so I get asked fairly regularly where someone should actually start if they want to learn to code. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people who give up don't quit because they're incapable. They quit because the process itself is often so aimless or just plain miserable. You get buried in theory with no context, or dropped in front of an empty editor with no sense of momentum. Boredom does the rest. Bootdev is designed deliberately against that. It's a platform for learning backend development, mostly Python, SQL, and Go. And instead of parking you in front of lecture videos, it gets you writing real code almost immediately in a structured, gamified progression. You solve, you build, you improve, and move forward at a brisk pace. I went back to it recently after using it years ago, and it's grown a lot. Tighter structure, more practice, and it's clearly built around effective repetition and feedback to foster coding instincts rather than just motivational fluff. Which also means it isn't for everyone. If you want something that pretends coding is effortless, this ain't it. But if you like learning by doing, for that, it has my honest endorsement. And you can read and watch everything on the platform for free. To unlock the interactive parts, head to boot.dev and use the code RagnarRox to get 25% off your first year on the annual plan. If that sounds interesting to you, then why not check it out? Alright, with that I say thanks a lot again to Bootdev for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to Max's journey into his own inner underworld. In the opening sequence of Sanitarium, we see the yet unknown protagonist drive along a coastal road on a rainy night, accelerating faster and faster. When he realizes the brakes aren't responding, it's already too late. The car breaks through the guardrail and falls off the cliff. The way Sanitarium opens shares narrative DNA with another late 90s cerebral genre piece, Planescape Torment. A protagonist awakens disoriented, injured, and nameless. His past is lost to him, the world around him fragmented and alien. And just like in Planescape, the arc seems familiar. Piece together your identity, find out what led to your condition, and uncover the truth that's been hidden even from yourself. And even more so than Planescape, which reaches outward to explore philosophy and ethics, Sanitarium turns inward with a journey that leads deep into the psyche. Our protagonist, the man with the bandaged face, wakes up in a grimy tower inside a dilapidated sanitarium. He doesn't remember who he is or even how he got here to begin with, and none of the inmates have a clue, or simply don't care. Within the ancient structure, terrified screams echo off the walls, and the other patients bang their heads against the wall, dance like chickens, or babble incoherent nonsense.
What bugs, Martin? I don't see any. Maybe they're not real.
Are you serious? These blood-sucking insects are bent on destroying the world.
Martin, think about it. How are some bugs going to destroy the world?
Well, look at them. These aren't normal bugs. These is robots. Little teeny robots.
A narrow walkway encircles a deep abyss. As we approach, one of the patients throws himself into it.
Hey, who are you?
Oh my God, no!
The place feels unreal, constructed rather than lived in, like a fever dream version of a mental ward envisioned by a gothic horror author who got too high on their own supply. In the center, below stained glass windows, we find an imposing statue of an angel, illuminated by warm candlelight. After some investigation, we find an ancient key that brings the statue to life.
It is so dark.
The angel addresses us, its voice calm, almost reverent, and gives us a task, a purpose.
Hear the cries of the children. The innocent are dying, and you only think of yourself.
Save the children. What children? And what do they need saving from? The angel offers no explanation. It only tells us that this is what must be done, as if it always has been. As if the question was never whether we would go, but only whether we were ready to hear it asked. And for reasons we don't yet understand, we accept. Maybe because in a place this broken, purpose, any purpose, feels like solid ground. And so it spreads its wings and takes us away. From here on out, things start to get strange. And I mean a lot stranger than what we've encountered so far. Our protagonist suddenly finds himself standing in the town square of a small village, the familiar angel statue looming over him. But this time, it shows no signs of life. Dazed and disoriented, we begin to explore. The village is inhabited exclusively by children, each and every one of them visibly deformed, and not a single adult inside. When we try to speak with them, they refuse. Suspicious, guarded, every conversation begins the same way. They ask for our name.
My name's Jesse Hatcher. What's yours?
But our protagonist genuinely doesn't remember his name, and he's not chaotic enough to just make up a name like Raphael Ambrosius Cousteau on the spot.
I can't remember my name.
Well, Mother won't let you talk to strangers, so you better leave.
But something begins to shift. Each time we try to remember, fragments start to surface, faint like echoes from somewhere just out of reach. A childhood memory, repeating, extending a little further each time it's triggered again. Until finally, a voice, his mother's voice, calling him by name.
Max? Sarah would like to see you now.
Well, they know our name now.
Well, now we ain't strangers anymore.
And just like that, the children start to talk. What emerges, conversation by conversation, is a world that's been running itself for a long time. The children have built something resembling a functioning society. Roles, rules, hierarchies, an effigy of adult society reconstructed from fragments of a world none of them seem to have actually lived in. It's Lord of the Flies with corn and pumpkins. eerie in its tidiness. A childhood that learned to manage itself because there was no one else to do it. But underneath the routine, there's a common thread emerging that shapes every conversation, every glance, every careful word. Mother. Not my mother, not our mother, just mother. A presence that lives across the corn maze, in a barn at the edge of the village. The children speak of her with a reverence that sits somewhere between devotion and fear, and they've learned, without anyone ever explicitly teaching them, that you do not approach the maze uninvited. The maze that stands between the village and the barn where Mother lives. The pumpkin-headed figures and crows are the sentries patrolling it, and they made the children learn the rules the hard way.
What lesson, Maria?
Not to look for our parents. Mother said we should never, ever do that. But I was too curious. Mother saw me. She told the other kids that I was bad. Then she made them put me in the patch. I don't remember much, just those nasty birds, black wings. They pecked at my eyes. It hurt a lot. But when the birds were done, Mother took the pain away.
When you grow up in a world where love is conditional, where affection arrives only when you comply and disappears when you don't need anyone to spell out the boundaries. You feel them, you develop an intuition for them. You learn to navigate around the source of pain without ever looking at it directly. The maze is a manifestation of that type of psychological perimeter, a border the mind draws around something it isn't ready to face. When we finally reach Mother, she's not at all what the word suggests. She's a grotesque, parasitic entity, something botanical and alien that crashed into the barn with a comet and through her influence slowly assimilates the children into something rooted and no longer quite human.
Nuh-uh. Mother said we'll live forever after she's finished with us.
Mother uses the language of care, of nurturing, while systematically overriding everything that made them them. This is what the chapter understands with uncomfortable precision, that the most suffocating authority rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives as love, as protection, as I only want what's best for you. The children don't resist because, from the inside, there's nothing obvious to resist. This is simply how things are. The only one who seems to sense otherwise and has the guts to express it is Maria, a blind girl on the edge of the village, carefully voicing doubts she can't fully articulate. She can't see Mother, which is maybe why she's the one who can perceive her most clearly. She represents that quiet inner signal, the one that whispers something is wrong here long before the conscious mind is willing to listen. What makes this dynamic especially insidious is that Mother rarely punishes directly. When Maria stepped out of line, it was the other children who were made to enforce the consequences, collectively and without question. This is a tactic as old as authoritarian systems themselves. Distribute the cruelty, implicate the community, and the source of harm never has to show its face. Everyone becomes the enforcer. No one feels responsible. Mother remains blameless. When Max finally destroys Mother, drawing lightning down into her through a rod with a metal crucifix, the children don't disappear or collapse. They slowly begin to return to themselves. That distinction matters. Confronting the source of the wound doesn't erase the people it shaped, and it also doesn't instantly transform them into what they once were. It merely stops the shaping. Maria finds Max at the exit. The children are gonna be okay, she tells him. They're finding their way back. Max steps through a tunnel of light and wakes up in the asylum's courtyard. The courtyard opens around him, wide, weathered, vaguely grand in the way these institutions sometimes are. Ancient brick walls, broad flights of stairs sweeping down towards a central fountain, dry and silent, and ringed by gargoyle statues that seem to have been watching for a very long time. Orderlies move through the space with the practiced indifference of people who have stopped being surprised by anything. He's been missing, someone tells him. And the tower, the place where everything started, it's gone, burned down overnight. Everyone inside it perished. Max was the only survivor. But he doesn't remember any of it. He was in the village, and it felt absolutely real to him. The courtyard's other residents are aghast. A man who's absolutely, unshakably convinced he is Elvis Presley.
Excuse me, what's your name?
Are you serious, man? I'm the king.
King of what?
King of rock and roll, man. I'm Elvis.
The Elvis? But I thought you were, dead.
No, that was all a hoax, man. The pressure was getting to me. I needed a break.
Another who is deeply, tenderly in love with a 6-inch red snapper. A preacher delivering passionate sermons to an audience of wooden disciples. At first glance, this reads like typical 90s media shorthand for mental illness. A grab bag of colorful eccentrics flying over the cuckoo's nest, standing in for the real thing. And maybe that's exactly what it is. But file that thought away for a moment. We'll come back to it. Max tries to explain what happened. The village, the children, mother. The orderlies react the way orderlies do. Some with impatience, some with barely concealed contempt, a few with a practiced blankness of people who have stopped listening. One or two are outright patronizing over it. Not one of them believes him. And standing there, listening to himself describe a corn maze guarded by pumpkin-headed figures and a parasitic alien entity in a barn assimilating children into plant-like organisms, Max hears it too. How he sounds. He looks around at Elvis, at the man with the giant fish, at the preacher and his wooden congregation. He sounds exactly like them. The thought arrives suddenly and lands hard. What if he belongs here?
Am I going mad?
Which makes it curious, doesn't it, that the place Max's mind chose to disappear into wasn't a fantasy of escape or wish fulfillment. It wasn't somewhere warm and safe and uncomplicated. It was a village of isolated, deformed children living in fear of a manipulative, abusive entity that used the language of love to subsume them. Of all the places a fractured mind could retreat to, why there? One of the orderlies, John Whitefoot, is by far the kindest person in the building. That much is clear from the moment you meet him. Patient where the others are dismissive, curious where the others have stopped caring. So when Max, having just described a corn maze and a parasitic alien entity living in a barn, braces for the usual reaction, Whitefoot doesn't laugh at him or call him a nut job. He has a theory.
What's your theory?
Well, I think that maybe your mind couldn't handle the thought of you abandoning those who needed help, so you constructed a world to hide in, inside your mind, until it was safe to come back. The town represented the tower, the children were the patients, and the missing adults represented the doctors and other authority figures who weren't around to help.
Huh, maybe you're right, but it all seemed so real.
Your mind is capable of wondrous things, Max. In your head, it was real.
It's a generous reading, a humane one. And for a game that rarely feels the need to explain itself to its audience, surprisingly on the nose. Almost disarmingly so. This is the kind of moment where the puzzle clicks into place and you think, there it is. The attentive, subtext-hungry first-time player will feel rewarded. I know, in that video I made on Sanitarium a decade ago, this exchange, this courtyard, this very conversation became the centerpiece of it. Whitefoot handed me the interpretation, it aligned with my gut feeling, and I took it home, satisfied. What makes this moment so subtly brilliant is precisely that it works. Whitefoot's reading is coherent, compassionate, and specific enough to feel true. The town as the tower, the children as the patients, the missing adults as the authority figures who weren't there. He's not wrong, not completely at least. He just doesn't go deep enough. Because he, just like the first-time player at this stage, can only see the tip of the proverbial iceberg. What's fascinating is that the one person offering Max a coherent explanation of his inner world is himself a resident of that world. A man inside the asylum, theorizing about the subconscious of another man inside the asylum. There's something slightly vertiginous about that if you let yourself notice it. So let's hold on to John's armchair diagnosis for now, and we will get back to this later when we're ready. For now, it's a start, something we can work with, and pull on the thread he's pointing at. Because before we go further, there's one small detail in the village worth pausing on. The entrance to the corn maze is locked. The combination to the padlock is the number of times each person has beaten Jessie at tic-tac-toe. Meg beat her 4 times. Eileen beat her 5 times. And the third digit is Max, because during the game you beat Jessie once. Yup, the combination is 451. Sanitarium is officially an immersive sim, folks. Pack it up. The lock only accepts the full combination after Max himself has played with and defeated her, which means the lock was waiting for Max, so to speak. This maze, this village, this world, it couldn't be fully navigated until Max arrived. And it's tuned to his specific history, his specific presence, a simulacrum built around him, for him, by him. It's the game whispering something crucial. This place didn't exist before Max needed it. What Whitefoot is hinting at is a known and well-researched phenomenon in psychology, dissociative escapism. When something happens that is too sudden, too overwhelming, or too relentless for the mind to handle, when it's exposed to a magnitude of strain or trauma it's not equipped to process in real time, it doesn't break, it bends. Like a branch that's hard and rigid breaks when exposed to great force, whereas a branch that's pliable and bends survives. The mind operates in much the same way when exposed to overwhelming external force. It tries instinctively to find the most immediately viable survival strategy available and takes it. To name one example, people who grow up in an emotionally volatile environment often tend to become hyper-aware of other people's emotions, reading micro-expressions like their lives depend on it. Because it does. Avoidance, people-pleasing, hypervigilance, and so on. Dissociative escapism is another such survival tool of the overburdened mind. People who recede into fictional interior worlds. The psychiatrist Judith Herman spent decades studying people who had survived the unsurvivable, war, abuse, prolonged captivity, and what she found again and again was that the responses we tend to pathologize, retreating, dissociating, disappearing into an interior world, these weren't symptoms of a damaged mind, but they proved the mind's extraordinary resourcefulness and intelligence in situations of prolonged extreme stress. It's the mind doing exactly what it was built to do, find a survivable environment when the current one is not. Dissociation in this context is the mind showing extraordinary competence. The worlds a mind builds in these situations, as random as they can seem, are highly purposeful, constructing an environment the real world has stopped providing. A place where effort still meets outcome. A place where the rules are learnable and the chaos has edges. When I was in my early 20s, I went through something that I know many people can relate to in their own lives, in one way or another. In that period of my life, everything had come apart at roughly the same time, the way things sometimes do, all at once, without warning, as if the universe decided to run several anthropological experiments simultaneously, and I was the guinea pig. I don't want to go into detail. The thing that matters is that from pretty much every possible angle, the direction I'd had for my life had collapsed. My environment had stopped making sense as a place where effort was rewarded and justified. And at that time, I didn't have the tools yet to understand what was actually happening to me, let alone do anything about it. What I had instead was Morrowind. I started playing it with casual curiosity, the way you pick up any game, really. But honestly, I had no idea how much it was what I needed at that particular time in my life. Because what it gave me, without me realizing it until many years later, was a world that responded. A place with rules I could learn, master, and trust, where when I put in the work, something came back. Many people I knew at the time had similar experiences, disappearing into World of Warcraft or RuneScape, but I was too antisocial for an MMORPG, believe it or not. Instead, I got swept away by the Byronic melancholy of Vardenfell. I built a life there. Not metaphorically, I mean I genuinely built one. I had my own house in Balmora, a library built with console command acquired furniture and all the books I carefully collected and curated from all across the land. I had a daily rhythm, habits, I roleplayed practicing magic in the mornings on the rooftop of my little house. I rode silt striders across the volcanic plains. While my meat space life felt like a complete dead end, what I felt here was something I hadn't felt in a long time outside: agency. People around me at the time had opinions about this, none of them particularly generous. And I understood even then why it looked the way it looked from the outside. Even I saw it. But in hindsight, I know now that this escape hatch had kept something alive in me that the outside world was doing its utmost to extinguish. The self-trust and confidence that I was capable of achieving goals, any goal, if I just put my mind to it. The rewards were digital, but the cerebral pathways it formed and maintained were real. I emerged from it eventually, found a new direction, one that felt right the moment I had taken the first step. I moved countries, learned with passion, and built something real for myself. And I genuinely don't think I'd have gotten there without Vardenfell. These days, when I feel the calling to boot up Morrowind again, it's a beckoning that evokes the feeling of a place I once called home. Returning feels like visiting a place I once lived. The landmarks are familiar, the music lulls me in like a comfort blanket, and hearing a silt strider call across the distance still does something to me I can't quite name. Like a scent sometimes evokes an instant avalanche of old memories and feelings. Nostalgia for a past home. Bittersweet, and not the least bit ashamed of it. There's a particular kind of contempt in society reserved for people who disappear into games, into fantasy worlds, parasocial relationships, or online communities, people whose entire life takes place on a screen. The word that gets used, usually with a slight curl of the lip, is escapism, as if escaping were the shameful part. In Japan, there's a widespread cultural phenomenon that started emerging and growing in the wake of the bubble years, called hikikomori, literally translated meaning something like pulling inward or being confined. People, often young men, who withdraw from social life almost entirely, sometimes for years. Their rooms become their worlds, and the outside stops being accessible altogether. It's been studied, pathologized, documented, and covered with growing alarm, and responded to, more often than not, with a mixture of pity and judgment. What gets discussed much less frequently is what lies beneath, the real root, the question of what it is they're escaping from. Because here's the thing about this cultural reflex to dismiss people who retreat into interior worlds. It says a lot more about the dismissers than the dismissed. It assumes as a matter of course that the outside world is always worth engaging with, that choosing reality as it is configured in the current moment is always the saner option, and that the person who checks out has simply chosen the easy path, lazy and contemptuous. But the truth is that sometimes the outside world is genuinely, measurably unbearable. Sometimes the nervous system has simply been exposed to more than it's able to handle, and the only intelligent, yet the only sane response is to find somewhere, anywhere that still makes sense. The mind reaching for a world that responds, that rewards effort, that has its bounds, and that has rules that make sense, and a horizon that feels like it belongs to you. It's the psyche doing the Sisyphean task of securing a survivable environment when the current one is not. It isn't always pretty or sustainable, and it rarely is the whole answer, but sometimes it's exactly enough to keep a kernel in you alive until you're ready to find and reclaim the rest. So, a man whose mind, under impossible pressure, built itself a hiding place. That much we can say with confidence. But the hiding place he built is fascinating and worth inspecting a little closer still. Because the mind doesn't construct at random, it draws from what it knows, from what it has lived. And what Max built wasn't a fantasy of power or escape or wish fulfillment. It was a village of children raising themselves in the shadow of something that called itself love. Judith Herman's work on complex trauma, the kind that doesn't come from a single catastrophic event, but from prolonged exposure to an environment where safety is never quite guaranteed, describes what happens to a developing self when the place that should be safest is also the place that requires the most vigilance. When love arrives with conditions attached, when the rules are unspoken, but the consequences for breaking them are vile. We don't know yet the full shape of what Max carries. His parents, in every glimpse the game offers us, appear genuinely kind, loving, present. So we're not drawing a straight line here, we're simply observing that the architecture of what he builds tells us something. That somewhere at some point this man learned what it felt like to navigate around a source of pain without being able to name it. What that source was, we'll get there. For now, what matters is what happens when he returns from the village and tries to share what he experienced. Nothing. The orderlies don't believe him, the other inmates don't register him. The world of the asylum has no framework for what Max just lived through, and no particular interest in developing one. Herman writes about the necessity of bearing witness, of having someone, anyone, acknowledge this happened, it was valid, and it mattered. Without this, we lack the necessary foundation to begin the healing process. The courtyard, in this sense, is its own kind of trauma. But then we meet Preacher Bob. Max retrieves a stolen cross and returns it to a man who's delivering passionate sermons to an audience of wooden disciples. In return, he is solemnly dubbed Saint Max of the House of Bob and presented with the Staff of Righteousness, which turns out to be a paddle.
For your performance of a miracle in our accursed times, I dub thee Saint Max of the House of Bob. Here is thy staff of righteousness. Lean on it, whilst you walk on the path of the Lord. Hallelujah!
Thanks. I'll use it for the good of mankind.
Hallelujah! Amen!
It's absurd, it's warm, and it is the first time in his story that Max achieves something that someone else notices and values. Small, slightly ridiculous, but real. It's the door opening just a crack, but that crack is enough to get the foot in. The village is only the first descent. The mind that built one world kept building others, and they go deeper.
What is your greatest wish?
I wish that I could see my sister again.
Max?
Now, you remember how Max recalled his name, right? In the village chapter, his mind gradually reconstructed a childhood memory, beat by beat, until he heard his mom call his name. This memory, it turns out, had way more to it than just his name. Before the beginning of the next chapter, we learn what it was that his mother called him for. His sister Sarah, terminally ill and bedbound, wanted to see him. Max, oblivious about her condition, asks if she wants to go to the circus with him.
Hey Squirt, feeling any better? I don't think I can go to the circus this year. We'll go next year. Can you do me a favor?
She then asks him to retrieve her favorite doll she got at that very circus a year ago from the attic. Max dashes up and rummages through the attic in a panic he doesn't quite understand.
Where is it? I can't find it, Sarah. I can't.
And exactly in that moment in which he fails to locate Dolly, Sarah passes away. Unlike in the previous Mind Plays, where we were seemingly thrown headfirst into a parable about narcissistic parental abuse without giving us a single clue about the origin of the wound, this time around the game leaves no ambiguity. Max lost his sister when he was young, his first intimate encounter with death and loss. And the way grief often works, especially on young and innocent minds and hearts, Max carried a crippling feeling of guilt with him ever since. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Max's failure to find Dolly had nothing to do with Sarah dying, but that's what his young mind understood, that the correlation equaled causation. And that wound he carried with himself for the rest of his life. So his mind created a circus. The circus is the place that his subconscious associates with happy times with Sarah. the place she was not able to visit with him anymore in her final days. And in this mental diorama, he even embodies her. We play as Sarah in this chapter, which is Max's mind trying to give her what has been taken from her. A place of laughter, of joy, of enthusiastic performers and a cheering audience. But this circus is a far cry from that. What was once a place of color and spectacle is now decayed and waterlogged. The performers move through their routines with the hollow persistence of those who have forgotten what the routines were for. Dejected faces, many of which hide their alienation behind biting sarcasm and scorn. As Sarah arrives, the circus ringleader, Mr. Baldini, welcomes her with practiced enthusiasm. She's the first visitor in months, and he invites her to explore the attractions by gifting her a handful of tickets to play Beat the Kraken for free. The circus town dwells on an island cut off from the mainland after a horrible flood. The inhabitants are slowly running out of supplies, most of them huddled together in the sagging main tent or around burning metal barrels, and the waters surrounding the island are home of a hungry kraken that devours anyone that tries to escape the island. Vardos standing lopsided in the mud, and rusty, barely functional attractions are scattered across little islets reachable via crooked makeshift wooden walkways. It's a place where hope has packed and left vacancy for desolation. Just like the village of the malformed children, the circus is an id machine, a projection of Max's innermost unprocessed feelings. In this case, it's the guilt over Sarah's demise that he failed to grieve in a healthy way until this day. The circus, traditionally a place of joy, is in a lifeless and dejected state, which mirrors Max's inner state. Joy as a mask worn for others, and for oneself, instead of an experience lived. The performers are marooned on the island, unable to leave, unable to change, trapped here by a flood that's symbolic for emotional overwhelm so intense that the nervous system simply shuts down. Grief is a natural healing process that, while feeling horrible at times, is the mind working through trauma and emotional wounds. When the ability to grieve is suppressed, a state of emotional stasis prevents the traumatized from moving past the wound. The game is pretty explicit about this. At the north end of the island, we find a pair of mounted binoculars through which we can see across the water and spot a mansion in the distance, unreachable from here, which turns out to be a manifestation of Max and Sarah's childhood home. In this mental simulacrum, Iggy the Squid is the reflection of this repressed grief in Max, once a part of the circus himself, now monstrous, unleashed and uncontainable, making it literally impossible to leave the island. But Iggy, we learn, is afraid of one thing and one thing only: fire. Sarah eventually learns the technique of fire breathing from the performer Inferno. With this, she eventually discovers and traverses a cavernous tunnel that leads off the island, Iggy's domain. And just like the pumpkin-headed sentinels in the corn maze, the man squid will attack Sarah at every step, and only by unleashing her fiery breath on him, she'll be able to fight her way through the tunnel and into the mansion. Fire is an element commonly considered wild and hard to tame, dangerous if it runs rampant, but that also gives life and warmth. The fire here represents raw emotions that before were suppressed, allowed to fester and corrode from the inside, but that are now unleashed freely, hot and wild. And that is Iggy's kryptonite. Moving forward doesn't mean erasure of grief, but releasing its chokehold, allowing it to pass through you, allowing oneself to feel what the nervous system needs to feel. And only through that act of letting it out can Max as Sarah reach the mental diorama of his childhood home, in which he encounters ghostly apparitions reenacting fragments of his repressed memories in the final days of Sarah's life. It is a confrontation with the memories his mind was not ready to face, until now. The quest eventually leads him to the attic, the place where his guilt originated, and finally he finds the doll his sister wanted. It's a subconscious manifestation of a frozen moment of both care and regret. Max retrieves Dolly and brings it to Sarah's apparition in her deathbed as an act of psychic reconciliation. This is the moment when Max turns back to himself and apologizes for letting her down when he believed she needed him the most. Finally, he is able to voice his guilt to her. And Sarah, speaking to him from her deathbed, forgives him.
I thought I let you down when you needed me most.
No, don't think that. You could never let me down. You're my hero.
See, obviously this can't be the real Sarah forgiving Max. It's not just that Sarah is long dead, but it's also what her apparition said. You're saving all those children. That is obviously not something the late Sarah was ever aware of during her lifetime. This is Max's subconscious forgiving himself. But what was it referring to here? The children in the village? Well, kind of, but also Max gradually keeps remembering more about his own past as his journey into the depth of his psychic underworld continues. He awakens near the roof of the asylum, and it comes back to him that, before the accident, he was a medical doctor himself, a pharmaceutical researcher to be precise, who was working on finding a cure for a deadly virus that had claimed the lives of many children over the past years. His mentor and superior in the pharma company, Dr. Morgan, was the leading scientist in the research on the DNA V virus, and he had developed a treatment that slows the progression of the virus down. What's odd, if you think about it for longer than a moment, is that Dr. Morgan is also the leading psychiatrist in the mental facility Max has found himself in after the accident. Morgan sure seems to be a hard-working fella, and so far, when we've encountered him, he always appeared calm and reasonable, reinforcing Max's awareness of his unstable mental state and reassuring that he is keeping him here for his own good. But what slowly comes to the surface is that Max's mentor had double-crossed him. Morgan deliberately undercut funding for Max's research for an actual cure, because curing patients would undercut a major source of revenue for the pharma company, of which he is, of course, chairman of the board. But that goes without saying. Max uncovers atrocious experiments conducted by Dr. Morgan, blood-soiled laboratories littered with mutilated corpses, all in the name of science, in the name of the greater good and profit. But as Max slowly gets to the bottom of his mentor's ethical transgressions, Morgan intervenes and overwhelms Max, sedates him, and puts him in an artificial coma. This is when Max retreats into his mind again, this time violently and aggressively. Betrayed and blindsided by those he trusted, his anger conjures a new persona. And Sarah's last words to him,
"You could never let me down. You're my hero,"
of a seed from which it grows. He awakens as Grimwall, a hulking, four-armed cyclops based on Max's favorite heroic comic series when he was a child. It's a pre-adolescent power fantasy come to life in the moment he finds himself disempowered by the very system he served with dedication, and by the people he trusted and looked up to. Max, aka Grimwall, finds himself in an organic, cybernetic world in which a race of robot insect hybrids have long warred with Grimwall's people, the Cyclopes. Yeah, if you thought this game was strange before, this is usually the moment where people go, wait, what the fuck? When I replayed Sanitarium a few months ago after a good decade, and I reached this chapter, I realized that I had totally forgotten about it, and my mind instantly went, oh yeah, right, this game gets weird. So here we are in the mythologically flavored techno-futuristic version of Starship Troopers.
The only good bug is a dead one.
Max's avatar Grimwall is a revered war hero among the Cyclopes, a legendary warrior who had single-handedly turned the tide in the Insectoid War. But he himself has no recollection of any of his glorious past. Amnesia within amnesia. Grimwall strips a deceased insectoid of its cybernetic harness to gain access to the hive, and after some snooping around incognito, he uncovers a betrayal of epic proportions. The insects have infiltrated and allied with the Cyclopes' leadership, and it turns out that the traitorous leader Gromna is performing cruel experiments on child Cyclopes to create a race of insect cyborg hybrids. It feels completely bonkers at first glance, but just like with Sarah's chapter, the game isn't exactly subtle about the surface meaning here. It's a direct metaphorical mirror of Max's betrayal by his mentor Dr. Morgan. Gromna Morgan. Morgan kneecapped Max's discovery of a true cure in favor of personal gain and experimental horror. Just like Morgan, in Max's eyes, had made a deal with the quote-unquote enemy, making the virus an instrument for his own ulterior motives, Cyclops leader Gromna had allied himself with the insectoids as a direct analogy for Zerg-like viral behavior. Max's psychological wound here is manifested as a war zone with mythic proportions. Biological war, betrayal, and infiltration against an enemy that's not just external, i.e. the virus, aka the bugs, but systemic, i.e. Morgan, aka Gromna. Max's grief becomes a world-spanning war of survival with, and that's important, clear sides and moral absolutes. Max's psyche echoes this particular wound not as personal failure, like in the case of Sarah, but as ethical collapse.
You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
Grimwald discovers child Cyclopes suspended in vats. Imprisoned, voiceless, suspended in development, and doomed to be sacrificed for Gromna's greed, echoing the children Max wishes to save in the real world. Rescuing them becomes a metaphor for rescuing what was frozen in trauma. In the course of this chapter, Grimwald must convince a Cyclopean ally of Gromna's betrayal and infiltrate the Hive's inner sanctum, which is when he finds out that Gromna had directed his insectoid allies towards a surprise attack on the Cyclopean capital. So Grimwald enacts a last resort intervention. He orders a nuclear strike on the incoming invaders to wipe them out in a single decisive strike, as one does. Grimwald is an interesting avatar for Max's psyche to choose. In a time where he's stripped of agency, he constructs a purebred power identity, strong, towering, infallible, and mythic. But Grimwald has amnesia. He is remembered as a hero by everyone, yet he feels unworthy, mirroring Max's survivor's guilt and imposter syndrome. And so his psyche has turned his grief into a hero complex. Grimwald and his arc during this chapter are Max's need to believe that he is still capable of saving others. And what's really interesting is that this chapter is also not a place of peace. It's a place of action, of reclaiming agency. He strikes with the nuclear option, cathartic, justified, and righteous, clean. It's a complete purge, total annihilation of the enemy. But that heroism is built on shaky ground. Imposter syndrome, unresolved guilt, and moral fury. So the question lingers, if the virus is the hive, and the system protects it, who is left to trust, if not yourself? If the innocent abandoned, the village of the autocratic child community governed by an authoritarian mother figure, was about unearthing the presence of Max's origin wound, and the circus was about reclaiming Max's ability to embrace emotions in the wake of traumatic grief, then Grimwald and his crusade against the cyborg insects was the pressure valve exploding, raw and long dormant emotions bursting out without restraint, with hot, unfettered fury. It's a nervous system's first, clumsy attempt at walking after a lifetime suspended in a straitjacket. In a way, it is a symbolic rebirth, isn't it? An amnesiac wakes up in the morgue, having, by definition, no clue how he got here. Did I mention Planescape Torment before?
Updated my journal.
As Max re-emerges to the real world as himself, he finds himself behind the closed metal door of a cadaver cooler. How did he get here? Was he falsely pronounced dead? We don't know, and things are starting to get increasingly surreal in this chapter, including the corpse of a woman conveying a message to him, the discovery of another man trapped in the same morgue, and an ancient talking tree that speaks in riddles like the Sphinx. Am I going mad? Okay, let us, for now, put another bookmark in this chapter and come back to this later. Because when Max eventually finds Dr. Morgan in yet another of his many offices, this one decorated with ancient Aztec relics, our nemesis disappears into thin air, and Max once again descends into the depths of mythology. He awakens before an altar where a high priestess awaits his coming, who welcomes him, showing blissful gratitude that he's answered the summons. Max, in this incarnation of his subconscious dungeon, has taken on the persona of Olmec, yet another four-armed mythic hero, this time a stone guardian and protector of an Aztec-inspired village. He finds a small village in peril and despair, suffering under the immortal wrath of the trickster god Quetzalcoatl, who has slaughtered the people's warriors and commands awe and terror from atop a stone pyramid. So what differentiates this four-armed warrior from the previous? Well, he's made of stone for starters, hardened to embody virtual invincibility, and this trait is reflected in the way Olmec carries himself. He speaks in blunt, quippy phrases, emotionally cold and distant, impatient, all function without compassion. He fulfills the villagers' requests for help out of divine obligation rather than kindness and care. Olmec is another metaphorical facet of instinctive trauma responses. Max's temptation to harden completely in response to overwhelming pain. Becoming stone, figuratively, seems like protection. The removal of feeling, of empathy, is a tantalizing notion. If I stop caring, I can't be hurt. Max's quest as Olmec is following in the footsteps of the Tin Man. He has to reclaim the warrior's heart. But unlike Grimwald's chapter, which pivoted around the reclamation of internal strength, Olmec's chapter is one of softness and emotional pliability. He must overcome elemental trials to recover tokens that represent different petrified facets of his self, inner resources Olmec, Max, must reclaim. He must follow instinct and patient observation in the Temple of Water, Wind, and the Temple of the Jaguar, tapping into a gentler strength than sheer physical force alone. The villagers sacrificed themselves in the hopes of appeasing Quetzalcoatl, symbolic for cycles of self-blame and learned helplessness. Max, as Olmec, must break this cycle by choosing conscious, personal agency. Trauma can make softness feel dangerous because it opens up the potential of being hurt, again and again, which can make rigidity, stoicism, and hardness feel like strength. But the strength that Max reclaims with the hero's heart is the soft part of him reclaiming his right to feel, not just to endure. Reclaiming the hero's heart represents the inversion and correction of this fallacy. Max starts this chapter hard and rigid, but his quest is about reclaiming vulnerability and compassion, which grants him the ability to accept and withstand pain. And with that, he's able to defeat Quetzalcoatl and save the village from certain doom.
A student came to his master with the question, "It is terribly hot, and how shall we escape the heat?" And he answered, "Go right down to the bottom of the furnace. No further pains will harass him."
There are so many open questions, aren't there? For starters, Max had a car accident. His face is completely wrapped in bandages. Makes sense. But why does he wake up in a sanitarium in the first place? This was largely a physical injury, but he's being treated for being completely delusional, which is shown by the CCTV recording we witnessed in the first chapter in Dr. Morgan's office in the tower. Did he bump his head so badly that he accidentally lobotomized himself? Doesn't really make sense, does it? The most obvious answer to me was always that having him declared insane would be the perfect cover-up for Morgan, as he's threatened by Max's discovery about his transgressions. By declaring Max a fool in the eyes of everyone, it would severely undermine his credibility.
You mean you believe me?
No, I mean, it sounds nuts. Just take your pill, Max, and you'll feel better.
But if you think closer, there's quite a bit more that just doesn't quite add up just yet. Dr. Morgan is a highly decorated virologist and chairman of the board of a large pharmaceutical company. How in the hell is this guy also the head psychiatrist of a large mental institute with, from what we can gather from conversations, at least several dozen patients? And in this capacity also an active researcher. Not just that it feels impossible, for there simply aren't enough hours in the day, Morgan being in any way involved in psychology or psychiatry is never once even mentioned in any of Max's flashbacks. And anyway, have you noticed how many offices Morgan has in the most nonsensical locations?
Dr. Morgan has an iron bust of himself. Pretentious.
Every single section of the sanitarium Max wakes up in the real world features yet another office of Dr. Morgan. At least one. And it's never referred to as Dr. Morgan's courtyard office or Dr. Morgan's morgue office. It's always just his office. We find one in the center of the tower in the beginning, sporting all that surveillance equipment. There's one adjacent to the courtyard from where Morgan conducts auditory experiments on his patients. Then he has an office next to the gruesome lab in the upper floor area of the sanitarium. And then he's got 2 more offices near the morgue. One of them in the back garden inside of what looks like a mausoleum. And it's opened by holding a prism we acquire from a talking tree guardian into a ray of light cast by a statue of an angel. Also, did you notice how the architecture of this place doesn't really make sense at all? What even is this garden morgue area, and why are there 2 offices, one in an Aztec mausoleum? Why is there a tiny bedroom in an isolated tower at rooftop level that can only be accessed via an architecturally nonsensical skywalk? And the angel statue, right, there was one in the very first chapter, right in the center of the tower walkway, the one that came to life and took Max away. When you first encounter it, it can easily be filed under Max being Delulu, but I don't think that's the actual answer.
These blood-sucking insects are bent on destroying the world.
Martin, think about it. How are some bugs going to destroy the world?
Well, look at them. These aren't normal bugs. These is robots. Little teeny robots.
Didn't this sound like utterly nonsensical gibberish the first time around? But now, with more context, we understand exactly what this guy is talking about. The question is, how could he even know about it? Could it be that none of this was real in the first place? What if all the strange goings-on in the waking world we were able to simply file under supernatural until this point are actually all intra-psychic? The Fool is, in many tarot spreads, the first card laid by default. The beginning of a journey of self-discovery. They start as a blank slate about to go out into the world on the road to self-realization and integration. Max wakes up in a sanitarium. He is the Fool. In many depictions, the Fool is standing on a cliff or next to an abyss. The first location we are in, the sanitarium's tower, has this odd, nonsensical architecture of having a literal abyss in the center of a circular walkway. Water running down from a sewage grate and people literally falling to their deaths down into the depths.
Shouldn't get too close to the edge.
And so, as the Fool starts his journey, what does he start with? The game literally starts in a tower. The tower is one of the most ominous of the major arcana in tarot. It represents the complete collapse of hierarchy and status quo. Things that have been taken for granted come crashing down. An omen that precedes change through immense pain. That is exactly the journey Max has ahead of himself. His subconscious, burdened with repressed and unprocessed trauma, is about to be revealed and challenged by a catabasis into the depth of his mind. And his assumptions about himself and the world around him are about to come undone before he finds himself in the space to start rebuilding from scratch. The very collapse of the eponymous tower is part of the card's symbolism. And wait a minute, this is literally what happens to the actual tower of the sanitarium. We learn in the courtyard, after returning from the village with the deformed children, that it has burned down and collapsed. And the fire? It started because of a faulty generator, the one we can see in the first chapter, throwing sparks and generally not looking in the best shape. Now, how does Max defeat Mother in the village chapter? He wires a metallic cross to a generator to catch a lightning bolt to set the barn in which Mother dwells ablaze. And right after this, Max learns how the tower burned down because the generator in it caught fire. The tower in tarot is depicted to be struck by lightning, an explosive flash of truth that instantly dismantles the ego and forces you to face raw reality. Anyway, speaking of the village, we have a society of children governing themselves. We have an authoritarian mother figure that uses the language of love and care to subsume the children into her plant-like organism, in which obedience is the prime directive and disobedience is collectively punished by the children themselves. Attachment trauma, parentification, emotional hypervigilance, identity suppression. The themes here are pretty distinct, but what never quite made sense to me, over the course of the rest of the game, we don't get a single hint at Max's parents being anything but loving, warm, supportive, and caring. The majority of flashbacks we get during the family mansion part at the end of Sarah's circus chapter. I've combed through the entire game like a manic private dick in search of even the slightest insinuation of abusive parenthood or something along those lines, which, would be the most straightforward explanation after what this village chapter set up thematically.
We ain't found shit!
So what is the village chapter about? We've established that this is, without a doubt, a fabrication of Max's mind, conjured by him, for him, the padlock combination for the corn maze that can only exist because of his presence, remember? 451, the IMSIM code that only works after Max's intervention. And this chapter is, in the context of the rest of Max's journey, clearly the place where his core wound is laid bare. Now, it is the running gag of immersive sims to have to feature 451 as some kind of numerical combination, but the number 451 didn't originate there. As I said, it is also featured on a church billboard referencing the non-existent Psalm 451. And 451, that's not just the door combination of Looking Glass Studios in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's of course primarily a nod to Ray Bradbury's dystopian novel Fahrenheit 451. Its title refers to the temperature at which paper incinerates, a cautionary tale about a totalitarian state in which knowledge and individualism is suppressed through oppressive means. Its core theme is the suppression of intellectual, individual thought in favor of enforced conformity. Okay, another thing. Mother, this alien entity, arrived here via the impact of a comet that crashed into the barn. When we read through the town's archives, we found out that this comet had been spotted a good while before its arrival, and it had invoked a bona fide religious frenzy among the townspeople. The local pastor started worshipping the expected impact of the comet as a rapturous celestial event, the Second Coming. It was dubbed, as we can also read on the church billboard, the Gate of Heaven. A comet. The arrival of a superior alien spacefaring race. As a sign from God. The Gate of Heaven. Heaven's Gate. Sanitarium came out in 1998, 1 year after the infamous New Age Christian cult Heaven's Gate committed mass suicide in March 1997. This incident was a cornerstone of news and media coverage at the time. There is absolutely no way it went past the developers at the time of the game's writing. The ritual death of its 39 members, which followed founder and leader Marshall Applewhite's belief that the passing Hale-Bopp comet was really an alien spaceship that marked the arrival of the biblical rapture, and that by taking their lives in the right instant, the human bodies would be transported on board and transformed into perfected beings. That is literally what Mother is doing to the kids of the village. As she arrived on Earth and witnessed horrible and normalized parental abuse, she decided, these parents are horrible, I will merge these kids into myself to become the perfect organism.
The entire town turned a blind eye to Jenny's crimes, and I watched. The people's vicious disregard for Carol's safety was no less a crime than her father's.
Heaven's Gate. Suppression of the self in favor of conformity. The village chapter isn't saying Max had a narcissistic mother. It's saying Max's psyche contains the imprint of a system, any system that used the language of love to demand conformity and punish individuation. The initial instinct to see, abusive parents when playing through this chapter isn't wrong per se. The symbolism is genuinely there. It's just that the game is operating at a higher level of abstraction than a biographical allegory about Max's specific childhood. It's not one bad parent, but a pattern that runs through families, institutions, cultures, religions, governments. mother, Heaven's Gate, Fahrenheit 451's regime. Three faces of the same underlying dynamic, but at completely different scales. Which, if you think about it, is actually a much more unsettling and universal reading. Because it doesn't require a villain in Max's past. It just requires that he, like most people, absorbed somewhere along the way the message that who he fundamentally is needs to be managed, contained, or overwritten to be acceptable. That the truth about himself is buried deep in service of self-protection. And isn't that exactly what the angel statue in the tower tells him to seek out?
What can I do?
Seek the truth.
The angel, that is also such an interesting beat that's easy to forget with everything the game throws at you. So much so that we just rushed past it the first time around while we already had so much else to digest. But the angel statue come to life is a so much more powerful cornerstone of this story, of Max's journey of healing than it seems at first glance, because it again functions on several layers simultaneously. What's happening here to Max is a classic case of what in theology is called annunciation, the moment of divine calling. The appearance of angels throughout Abrahamic scripture is something that is commonly described as a blissful experience in the purest sense of the word. Bliss as an equal measure of fear and joy, and that duality is exactly what lands in the tower scene for Max. The angel is not here to comfort Max, it arrives with a task. And Max accepts it with the same mixture of dread and something that almost resembles relief, because in a place this broken, being chosen for something, anything, is its own form of grace. What's fascinating about the concept of annunciation narratives throughout scripture is that the chosen one never feels ready. Mary says, "How can this be?" Gideon says, "But I am the least of my family." Jonah runs in the opposite direction entirely. Luke was going to Tosh's station to pick up some power converters. The calling arrives before the capacity feels sufficient. So Max asking, "What can I do?" is that exact beat. Not a confident hero accepting his quest. A confused, injured, amnesiac man in a nightmarish tower asking, genuinely, vulnerably, "What could I possibly do?" And just like Gabriel doesn't give Mary instructions, the angel Max encounters doesn't answer the question either. It just takes him under his wings and delivers him to the place where the work can begin. Which is also exactly what the psyche does when it initiates healing. It doesn't wait until you feel ready. It just begins. Listen what the angel says when Max is wondering, "Am I going mad?"
You're alive. Am I going mad?
Listen. Hear the cries of the children. The innocent are dying, and you only think of yourself.
Stop thinking of yourself. You have to save the children. And it's just like so often in this game's writing that this is a double entendre that we only understand in retrospect. The children, at first glance, refer to the malformed children in the village, but on a deeper level, she refers to Max's hero complex about saving all the children in the world to redeem himself for his perceived responsibility for Sarah's death. This answer the angel gives is fascinating if you think about it, because it's simultaneously compassionate and also slightly deflecting. The angel redirects Max's anxiety about his own sanity outward, toward the children, toward purpose, toward action, which is the exact coping mechanism he's used to deflect the grief for his sister in the past. The angel is wise enough to know Max can't face himself directly yet, so it enables him by giving him a surrogate mission first. Ground zero. Okay, give me a moment. Okay, so the face of the angel. Believe me when I say I inspected this cutscene and the one when we meet Inferno, the fire breather in the circus, with a magnifying glass. Because during the latter one, we see her morph into a scene of Max's wedding, and she looks exactly like his wife Jennifer. And yeah, the angel uses the same facial model. There's no doubt about that. The same face as his wife, the person Max trusts the most in the waking life, and the person who, through how she shows up across the narrative again and again, was the witness to Max's trauma, and thereby the foundation for him to begin his healing journey. And it's not just here. In the chapter where Max awakens in the morgue, a female corpse on a slab at one point sits up and warns him about the dangers on his journey.
Beware, Max. The closer you come to reaching your goal, the more danger you are in. Someone seeks to keep you here with us forever. One who will do anything to keep you from leaving the asylum.
As we just said, Sanitarium loves his double entendres, and this one is really a triple entendre. On the surface, this refers to Morgan, but considering the timing of when this harbinger appears, it is also right before Max takes on the persona of Olmec, stoic, immovable, emotionally repressed and rigid. A psyche that does not want to change because it does not believe that it has any need for self-improvement. Nothing can touch me. Nothing makes me feel, therefore I am fine. And the third layer of her message, well, we'll get to that later. Anyway, her facial model is also strikingly similar to Inferno/Jennifer/ the Angel statue. Plus, they're dubbed by the same voice actress. Sounds far-fetched? Think about Inferno's role in the story. She literally teaches Max as Sarah fire-breathing, the metaphoric ability to direct his repressed emotions outward, which is the very thing that defeats Iggy, the monstrous squid that blocks the path towards accessing the true memories of Sarah's demise. This is where it all began, the death of Sarah. And it's so almost silly, really, if you think about it, right? Max, when he was a maybe 8-9-year-old boy, he lost his little sister at a time when death and grief was still uncharted territory to him. She asked him to get her something, he couldn't find it, and she passed away. And that's also just how Max remembers it. His inability to comprehend the loss of her and grieve her death channeled into a self-flagellating scapegoat. I let her down when she needed me the most. This is actually a very common occurrence. In psychology, this is referred to as illusory control, the tendency to perceive personal agency over events that are actually uncontrollable. Adults do this too, but children are especially susceptible, as a young mind hasn't yet fully distinguished between internal mental events and external reality, so the boundary between correlation and causation is genuinely blurry to them. In the context of grief and loss specifically, the mind reaches for a casual connection because the alternative, that devastating things can happen with no agency, no warning, no logic, is existentially unbearable, especially for a child. Like, when I was 6 years old, I was looking forward to an advent calendar for Christmas, and one day my grandmother surprised me with a hand-knitted one. A beautiful gift, but young me had set his heart on the same cheap cardboard chocolate advent calendar I'd gotten the year before. And without any concept of how much heart and effort a hand-knitted calendar takes to create, I started crying in disappointment. And my grandmother happened to pass away just a few days later. Of course, it had nothing to do with my reaction. She was completely sweet about it, and I even ended up loving the calendar on the same day. But for many, many years, I had internalized this notion that it was my spoiled brat reaction that was responsible for her demise. Magical thinking. In Max's case, this childhood wound never healed, and he likely was never even aware of it being there to begin with. Which is exactly the significance of the first Mind Place, the village where Max saves the abandoned children from Mother. Saving the children became his white whale, his symbolic crusade towards redemption, something he chased all of his life out of ulterior altruism, if you will. If I achieve this arbitrary, extremely lofty goal, then I will be forgiven. For the failing that was never mine to begin with. It's an impossible goal with an unnecessary motivation.
What book are you reading? Is it a comic book?
What? This is a classic, young lady, not some piece of trash. It's the epic saga of a man obsessed with killing a great white whale.
Oh, that poor whale.
No, you're missing the point. The whale is the manifestation of all earthly evils, and the man's pursuit is... Oh, forget it.
When a game like Sanitarium gets as ham-fisted as dropping a direct interpretation of the subtext of Moby Dick into its dialogue, it's to make a point, to underline the obsessive nature and self-righteousness in Max's motivations. Now with this context, let's think back on that kind reading by the orderly John Whitefoot from earlier.
Well, I think that maybe your mind couldn't handle the thought of you abandoning those who needed help, so you constructed a world to hide inside your mind, until it was safe to come back. The town represented the tower, the children were the patients, and the missing adults represented the doctors and other authority figures who weren't around to help.
So you see how it's not wrong per se, right? But it is also lopsided and incomplete. And more importantly, it shifts Max's, and by extension the player's, attention in a direction that steers away from the actual truth below. He's a representation of the most introspective lens Max is at the current moment in the story capable of applying to his strange journey. And in that spirit, remember when we noticed how the inmates, especially in this chapter of the game, feel like a cast of cliché mental illness stereotypes? Which feels at a glance a bit in bad taste when we assume that what we're seeing here is the quote-unquote real world when we play through the game for the first time. But when you consider that all of this is happening in Max's mind, it puts a different spin on it, doesn't it? Like that this is Max's subconscious idea of people in mental institutions, hyperbolized and unfiltered of course, but so far from how he sees himself. In his real-world medical career, just like Morgan, he is not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or anything adjacent, and by coping via lifelong striving for the unachievable, he always regarded himself as well-adjusted, not in need of any psychological introspective work. Which is why the moment where the thought arrives in him here, wait, I'm sounding just like them, is so much more profound than it appears at first.
Am I going mad?
In that same spirit, the circus chapter is about unlocking the cage where all the suppressed emotions were hidden away for years for the first time, quite literally. After Sarah learns to unleash fire, she has to unleash the caged beast that will seek out the entrance to Iggy's lair, whom we have to confront before getting access to the real memories of the time of Sarah's death. In Tarot, the Death Arcana does not mean you are going to die, like it's so often falsely attributed. Rather, the Death card is a harbinger for major transformations, through endings and things running their course towards new beginnings. In other words, it's about letting go of something that anchors you in order to move forward.
Goodbye, Sarah. It's time for me to face the future. Rest well.
What does that actually mean, to let something rest? To put something down that you've been carrying so long you've forgotten it as weight? There is a man on a journey. At one point, he encounters a river, too wild and dangerous to swim across. So he gathers wood and other materials and builds a raft that gets him safely across to the other shore. And as he stands there on the bank, looking back to where he came from, he thinks, this river was fierce and the traversal was dangerous and taxing. I've built this raft with my own hands and it served me well. I should carry it with me on my journey. And so he shoulders the raft and marches onward into the mountains ahead. This parable is one of the fundamental teachings in Zen, and it can be applied to many things in life: attachment, belief, and coping mechanisms that successfully enable us to survive overwhelmingly difficult situations in life. To reiterate what we talked about in regards to the studies of Judith Herman, people who, for instance, survive emotionally extremely volatile life situations often struggle later in life because these mechanisms never loosened their grip after having outlived their usefulness and start having a detrimental impact on their lives post-survival. It's like pointing at the moon and mistaking the finger for the moon. But what does it look like when someone like Max carries the raft into the mountains instead of leaving it behind once it served its purpose? The game answers this question with its main antagonist, Dr. Morgan. In Max's subconscious, Morgan is demonized beyond any semblance of humanity. Gruesome torture experiments carried out on helpless test subjects, children submerged in vats, and in the Hive chapter in the shape of Gromna, literally betraying his entire race to the quote-unquote enemy. But the story of the real Morgan is not as black and white as Max's psyche conveniently paints it. In various flashbacks, we learn how Max and Morgan met at the beginning of their professional relationship. Max shows up in Morgan's family estate, meeting his employer-to-be in front of a gigantic portrait painting of Morgan's father. At one point, the man himself barges into their conversation and reveals a clearly toxic parenting dynamic. Morgan is one of the most decorated students in his field, about to enter his final exam, perfectly prepared, while simultaneously establishing highly ambitious medical research projects. An extreme overachiever if there ever was one. But the father has no praise or support to offer, but exclusively berates him about not studying enough, about doing things the wrong way, about disappointing him. This pattern is known in psychology as narcissistic injury deflection. The parent experiences the child's success as a threat to their own sense of superiority, so they preemptively diminish it. The psychological long-term effect in the child's mind is a very specific wound that is often carried late into adult life. Chronic striving without a rival. No matter what you achieve, the internal parent voice never says enough, which means the goalposts are always moving, internally long after the actual parent is gone, which is exactly Morgan's pathology. He became the most powerful man in his field, and it was never enough. The white whale was never really the virus or Max or the money. This framing is important because it does multiple things at once. For one, it reframes Morgan from the unequivocally evil monster to a tragic product who himself was the subject of a traumatic wound that never healed. Overachieving to meet impossible goalposts was his Raft, and he never managed to leave it behind, becoming someone for whom enough was structurally impossible. Which makes him all the more frightening as an antagonist because he's comprehensible, human. Max's wound is not identical to Morgan's. His parents were supportive, loving, and encouraging. His aspiration grew from misattributed guilt over the imagined responsibility for his sister's tragedy. But the way his psyche attempted to cope with it had taken on a very similar shape. Max set himself an internal goal that was overwhelmingly absolute. Save all the children in the world. Not actually motivated by altruism, but by the self-centered need to avoid grieving a wound his young self never comprehended, nor understood was even there to begin with. This is Max's journey, and this reframing of Morgan as the antagonist agent in his tale turns him into more than just the bad guy to defeat. Morgan is Max's dark mirror. He represents what Max could turn into if he does not grieve, process, and integrate the trauma of the festered wound he carried for all his life. Now, I mentioned in the last chapter that the corpse lady's warning in the morgue was not just a double but a triple entendre, right?
Someone seeks to keep you here with us forever. One who will do anything to keep you from leaving the asylum.
Yes, Morgan wants to make sure that Max never leaves this place, but when you consider what Morgan's projection and Max's subconscious represents, his Jungian shadow, the parts that want to prevent him from seeing clarity.
Seek the truth.
So who this harbinger in the guise of Jennifer truly points at is Max himself. His internal resistance to face the uncomfortable truths about himself in favor of placing all the blame outward and feeling righteous and superior. The part of himself that wants a clear enemy to destroy and that wants to wall the truth behind impenetrable armor of stone. Grimwall is Max at his most mythic and his most fragile simultaneously. A legendary hero, towering and forearmed, remembered by everyone around him as the warrior who single-handedly turned the tide of an entire war, and yet he remembers none of it. His identity borrowed from a childhood comic. It is performed heroism, strong on the outside, hollow on the inside. In the moment Max felt most stripped of agency, betrayed by his mentor, sedated, discarded, his psyche reached for the largest, most indestructible avatar it could think of. A childhood power fantasy where the line between good and evil is clear and binary, scaled to mythic proportions. And when Grimwall finally faces the source of the betrayal, he defeats it with a nuclear strike. Devastating, absolute. The enemy annihilated in a single decisive blow. It feels righteous, it feels earned, and in the emotional logic of the Hive, as his mind plays, it is. But righteousness and resolution are different things. Max's fury is real and valid. The wound that generated it is real. But the nuclear option forecloses the room for complexity, for grief, for growth, for the question of what comes after the genocide. Grimwall's arc is Max shouldering the raft, marching toward the mountains. Raw, unrelenting force. Force turned entirely outward. The answer to pain that never has to feel the pain.
Hate! Hate!
Olmec is the logical evolution of Grimwall. In the persona of the ancient stone guardian, Max wakes up in front of the high priestess of the village. He is still four-armed and built like a hulking colossus, but something in the register has shifted. Where Grimwall was fire and fury, Olmec is stone, cold, impatient, emotionally sealed. He fulfills his obligations to the village out of duty rather than care. He speaks bluntly, harsh, impatient, unfeeling. His hardness is armor, the desire, after all the pain Max endured, to stop being emotionally vulnerable. But Olmec's entire chapter is about refusing to let him stay there. To prove himself worthy of the warrior's heart, he must sit with the ghosts of the fallen and listen to their stories. He must walk into the fire temple and tolerate pain rather than avoid it. He must follow instinct through the temple of water and patient observation in the temple of the jaguar, tapping into a gentler strength than sheer physical force alone. The High Priestess Major Arcana in Tarot represents the quest for intuition over intellect, wisdom that comes not from force or achievement or external validation, but from stillness and turning inward. She's the threshold guardian of the unconscious, the one who says the answer is already inside of you, if you sit still long enough to hear it. Olmec's quest is exactly about this, to tap into that inner stillness. The reclamation of the heart as the capacity to feel what is real, to trust what is known, and to stop performing strength long enough to discover what strength actually is. To stop treating emotions, even those commonly attributed negatively, as something that has to be avoided, prevented, or evaded. And when Max finally holds the warrior's heart in his hands, integration is no longer an outward destination, but a state of being that was always there. Within the metaphor, think about it like this. When you're truly happy because the external circumstances in your life have finally lined up for once, maybe you're in love and it's reciprocated, maybe you've achieved a goal you've worked towards for years, whatever it is, the happiness itself is not something that's given to you from the outside. It comes from within you, from your own capacity to feel it. Integration. We've been circling around the term integration over the course of this essay, but we've never really defined what it actually means. In psychology, the notion of what we're talking about goes back all the way to Carl Gustav Jung. Individuation as the lifelong process of integrating the fragmented aspects of the self into a coherent whole. The shadow, the anima, the persona, all the parts we split off and suppress. Judith Herman, who we've talked about before in the context of complex trauma research, describes the same concept as the third stage in the process of trauma recovery, reconnection. The fragmented aspects of the self recognized, reclaimed, brought into coherent wholeness. The term integration in this context goes back to Dan Siegel. He described it explicitly in a neuroscientific context, the linking of differentiated parts into a functional whole. His definition is almost poetic in its simplicity. Integration is coordination of difference. The parts that used to clash start working together in unison. This is exactly what happens in the final chapter of Sanitarium, and what the game, to the letter, expresses in a game mechanical metaphor. After we get flashes of the alleged real world where we see Morgan inject poison into comatose Max's IV, he finds himself in a surreal limbo world with floating islands of all his previous mind places, in a race against time to awaken from his coma before the poison reaches his veins. Shattered fragments of the circus, the hive, the village, the Aztec world, like Lego parts from different sets merged together at random and suspended in liminal space. Everything is familiar, but it's oddly, seemingly nonsensically rearranged. His inner world is in flux, and the walls between the compartments start to come undone. The central twist of this part, Max steps into the shoes of his alter egos again. All of them at once. Or rather, we can freely swap between embodying Sarah, Grimwall, and Olmec. Each of these personas have a different forte. Sarah, nimble and small, fits into tiny spaces and crevices and, nooks and crannies.
Nooks and crannies, yes.
The hulking Cyclops brute is really strong, and Olmec, made of stone, is virtually indestructible. It's pretty straightforward. So purely on a mechanical level, this is not something riveting. It's a twist on the Maniac Mansion, Day of the Tentacles switcheroo adventure game. But what it says is profound. Strength, sensitivity and flexibility, and resilience. These traits are available to Max now, freely, without being attached to the wound that created them. What the game says here is, these capacities don't disappear when the wound starts healing. Instead, they're no longer compulsions, but turn into tools, personal strengths rather than survival mechanisms. This is integration in the spirit of Dan Siegel's definition, not the erasure of what you've built to survive, but its liberation. The parts that used to clash start working together in unison. After this penultimate puzzle gauntlet, Max transmogrifies back into his true form and steps into a portal, and finds himself on a checkerboard floor. Above him, a grotesque and distorted head of Dr. Morgan floats and taunts him, chides him, belittles him.
You failed the children of the world, as you failed your sister when she needed you most. You don't have the courage to save them, nor the strength to do what's necessary. You failed everyone.
And in this final confrontation, Max stands in front of his dark mirror reflection, which is, as we said, what Morgan ultimately represents. What Max could become if he isn't able to put down the Raft. He's stripped of his alter egos again, but what's interesting is that each avatar can be found on the side of the checkerboard, holding a glowing orb that Max must reclaim while evading shifting patterns of the same black goo his shadow self is made of on the floor. What's interesting and very deliberate is that these three statues stand also on the side of his shadow self, but unlike him, his dark doppelganger has no black puddles to evade, no obstacle, no wound. Because Max's dark mirror self isn't a different person, it is Max without the weight of what he carried. For Max himself, the only path forward is through the goo, through the wound itself. And as he retrieves each orb, something clicks into place. The game's final statement, delivered entirely through mechanics. Max's alter egos weren't separate personalities constructed by trauma to begin with. They were facets of a single person, temporarily fragmented by the weight of what he carried, and now, one by one, recognized and reclaimed. Max isn't becoming someone new, which is such a tempting notion when you're in the thick of it.
Maybe this is the new me! Maybe this is the new me.
These personas and their strengths, they were always Max. Sarah was always Max, Grimwall was always Max, Olmec was always Max. And now they are integrated, finally whole. Morgan dissolves. The taunting voice, the impossible goalposts, the chronic striving without a rival, it all goes quiet. and Max can finally step out of his intrapsychic purgatory. We see him wake from his coma before the poison reaches his veins and he pulls out the IV. In the final shot, we see Morgan in the hospital with a knowing expression on his face.
It's over.
I'm back. It's over.
And then, the credits roll. We see a framed picture of Max, his wife Jennifer, and their newborn child, and on an AM/FM radio, a broadcast is played that summarizes the events that followed. The evil Dr. Morgan is in jail, Max's cure for the DNAV has gone into large-scale production, and successively saved the lives of many children across the world. Happy end. I'm gonna be honest, this ending of Sanitarium always felt tonally a bit off compared to the rest of the game. Had the budget run out for a proper ending sequence, or did the publisher demand a more positive ending compared to something darker that was originally written? I thought of these possibilities, but they don't feel very likely to me, honestly. What I do find noteworthy is how, after everything we've learned and dug into, it's safe to say that the game showed virtually nothing of the actual outside world between the car crash and Max waking up. Even the radios scattered throughout the game that seemed to give us glimpses of the outside world were not reliable. They were all filtered through Max's internal lens. But the message it conveys doesn't really hold water now, does it? Because anyone who's worked through deep-seated traumatic wounds and managed to, quote-unquote, put the raft down knows that integration doesn't mean now everything will be good and nothing bad will ever happen again, nor will anything ever hurt you again. That is the faulty logic that a mind pursues that's still in the thick of it. Instead, what you take away from it is the confidence that whatever life throws at you, you can handle it. That you're not afraid of being afraid anymore, and thereby break the insidious feedback loop that anchored you before. You don't have to carry the raft with you at all times. You know how to build one when you need it. You've done it before. Given that Sanitarium is essentially unreliable narrator the video game, combined with the odd tone of the credits, seriously, what's with this odd remix track playing at the end?
This is a test of the subject's threshold.
Bare feet slippers?
You need them to go on the rides, of course.
Must I pass through the bowels of the monster?
This is a confusing mess.
What?
I wish I knew, man.
Maybe we've never actually left Max's mind place after all? Am I going mad? Ultimately, what I appreciate the most about Sanitarium is how intricate it's constructed, in a way that the more you dig and the more you lose your mind over it, the more you find how nothing was put in this game just willy-nilly. That ultimately, just like a dream that feels meaningful, the important thing is not the symbolism, i.e., what does it mean mapped one-to-one, but what does it make you feel? The tarot symbolism, for instance. While I was replaying it, it blew my mind how perfectly it maps onto the Fool and the tower that collapses, followed by Death, strength inverted, the literal High Priestess greeting Max, and then culminating in the World, the card that represents integration in the truest sense. But was it intentional? Did the developers really think of a tarot spread when writing the game's narrative? I can't say with certainty. What do you think? Ultimately, and that's my point here, it doesn't matter, but what this corollary illustrates is that the journey Max undergoes through the total collapse of his internal hierarchy towards rebuilding inner security from the ground up is a universally human experience. So rather than Sanitarium is actually a tarot spread, but hey, it's just a theory, what really matters is that whoever came up with and wrote the game's narrative wrote it from experience, not from a place of int, but from a place of whiz. And whiz can't be faked. Which is exactly why this game, when I replayed it over a decade later, and with the experiences of going through the gauntlet of processing lifelong traumatic wounds myself, it felt like a completely different game. Same broadcast, entirely different bandwidth.
Sanitarium intake ledger. Admissions processed in order of severity. The management assumes no responsibility for prolonged stays. Nathan Gillick. Diagnosis: observed simultaneously in multiple locations. Treatment: unclear. Shannon Blue. Presenting condition: acute creative mania. Patient has been observed producing the elaborate and deeply unsettling, narrative-driven psychological horror medical RPG Flesh Blossom during what she insists on calling spare time. Shows no signs of stopping. Prognosis: incurable. Staff note: we played the demo and are in equal parts impressed and appalled by the accuracy in depicting the cosmic horror of the medical profession. Recommended course of action: play the demo. You can find a link in the description. We cannot help her and the developers at Crimson Pearl Games. Perhaps you can. John Boring. We attempted to review their file but kept falling asleep reading it. Solatool. Suspected diagnosis: multiple personalities. Treatment: live-action role-playing. Teraflops. Staff noted a concerning enthusiasm for things going slightly wrong. Patient appears to find this funny. Fun is not allowed. Tabby. Soft, quiet, occasionally knocks things off tables without apparent motive. We suspect this is pathological. Catherine Escobar. We wish to make clear that we consider and immediately rejected the obvious reference. Patient deserves better. Angelo Benedetti. Extra rations of oatmeal for good behavior. Amber Wiggins. Observation: radiant. Long-term prognosis: blinding. Zodi. Diagnosis pending. Refused to provide sufficient information. Increased dosage of sodium thiopental. Nathan Gillick. Diagnosis: observed simultaneously in multiple locations. Treatment unclear. Henrik van Rensselaer. Diagnosis: can only count in hexadecimal. Expected treatment duration: B weeks. Ari Orison. Staff note: do not approach unarmed before breakfast. Dana Rosa. No diagnosis. Appears well adjusted. Consider altering medication. Chris D. Diagnosis: spelling things their own way. Treatment: daily rations of crab cake. Morrigan K. Staff observation: believes to be a minor deity. Treatment: daily sacrifices and mead. Uziel 1447. Diagnosis incomplete. We are still evaluating Uziel 1 through Uziel 1446. Billy Lott. Staff note: oscillates between extreme violence and extreme chill. Administer cannabis sativa. 9ball 9606. Diagnosis: clairvoyance. Treatment is up to chance. Carrie George. Admitted under circumstances that remain, to this day, perfectly ordinary. Staff finds this suspicious. LSNHNG. Diagnosis: inability to use vowels. Treatment: LBTM. Link Hughes. Suspected occupation: finding things. Long-term prognosis: won't find them. Aria. Diagnosis: solitary serenade symptom. Suggested treatment: choir practice. Caspar Rom. Diagnosis: phases through walls, but only at full speed, and it only works 50% of the time. Righteous Itch. Diagnosis: eponymous. Treatment: delousing powder. Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strong. Admitted together, filed together. All separation attempts failed. Kyle Lee. Patient has chosen solitary confinement when Bill Clinton became president. Thwagams. One of our longest-standing patients. Has seen this institution through many iterations, upheavals, and complete reinventions of the decor. We do not know what we would do without them. Nathan Gillick. Diagnosis: observed simultaneously in multiple locations. Treatment unclear. Phoenix up above. Prognosis: catabasis. Lucas Ferreira Leite. Staff note: insists on wearing 3 layers of underwear. Kenneth Ward. Diagnosis: watchful. Treatment: ignore completely. Aurora Melpomene Crescendo. Patient reportedly changed their username specifically to hear how it would be pronounced. We refuse to attempt to pronounce Aurora Melpomene Crescendo. Corey Marr. Suspected diagnosis: good faith. Treatment: daily sessions of social media debating. Ronan Crom, also known as Daniel 242172. 2 names, 1 patience. The management is billed accordingly. Gehennas. Diagnosis, extreme chills. Treatment, 2 weeks in the Valley of Fire. The Spiral Architect. Diagnosis, non-Euclidean personality disorder. Treatment, listen to a music cassette by MC Escher. Laird Wakala. Staff note, only touched with a 10-foot pole. Jean, readmitted after release and successive break-in attempt. Thomas Bona. Diagnosis, can't tell left from right. Treatment, tattoo little letters on the hands. Matt Gretton. Staff note, keeps slipping on freshly waxed floor. Provide with grippy socks. Sunny Sky. Diagnosis, optimism. Treatment, 3 consecutive viewings of this video. Swiss Hat Mod. Observations, patient appears to be able to see through walls. Treatment, Punkbuster. Ronin Crafts. Currently writing their thesis, I have no lord and I must craft. Vasily Prokhorov. Diagnosis, auditory notification phantom echo. Here's text alerts that do not happen. Treatment, sensory deprivation chamber. Chuck Taylor. Diagnosis, OSCD, obsessive sneaker crafting disorder. Nikon the Brave. Diagnosis, post-social audit loop, the obsession to analyze the completely mundane conversation from 2014. Treatment, 150 milligrams of IDGAF. Nathan Gillick. Diagnosis, observed simultaneously in multiple locations. Treatment, unclear. Sable Cowell. Diagnosis, digital hoarding compulsion. Maintains uncountable browser tabs open out of fear of losing history. Treatment, RAM upgrade. David Zelenak. Diagnosis, compulsive need to finish things. Has not yet finished anything. Treatment, see previous entry. Vincent Kavanaugh. Experiences time in the wrong order. Treatment, scheduled for an appointment last Tuesday. J.R. Smith. Diagnosis, persistent feeling that something important was left behind. Staff note, it was. Do not specify what. And Nathan Gillick. Diagnosis, observed simultaneously in multiple locations. Treatment, unclear. This concludes the intake log for this admission cycle. The management thanks all patients for their continued support of this institution. Without you, we would have considerably fewer reasons to keep our 5 lights on. Until next time, ta-ta!